Welcome to the third and final video for chapter 14. So we have two main topics to finish up. The first is we'll go through several influences in terms of the development of personality, and the last one we'll talk about humanistic personality, which is just another way to frame it. So in terms of genetics, the first thing that I want to throw out there is the term temperament. And temperament is the way that most of the field of psychology frames the genetic influence of personality. And the reason that it's framed that way is temperament is believed to be genetically influenced. And so it does bring in the genetic influence. But it also is often talked about in reference to infants and young children. So essentially, what we can look at and talk about is that babies are really different from each other. If you have maybe younger siblings or cousins, or maybe you babysit, you've been around different babies, some of them are, super hard to calm down. They're just crying and they always seem upset about something, but you don't know what. Some of them are super cuddly. And so the field of psychology asks the question of why? Why do we instantly see these differences in babies? And why do these differences seem to predict long-term outcomes? Because we know that babies that are more negative on the emotionality pole, that are harder to soothe, those babies tend to grow up to have more difficulties. They're more anxious, more neurotic. And so this really led to the subfield or the sub area of personality called temperament. And so it is, I'm sorry, that's a typo. That should not say super table. That should say super stable. So temperament is very stable in the sense that we can use temperament to predict older adults' personality. It is essentially the foundation of personality because it does feel a little weird to talk about personality when you're talking about babies. And so temperament is essentially the early markings of someone's later personality development. It's also really interesting to note that there are pretty consistent physiological differences even in infancy. So we can use babies' heart rates, how reactive their heart rate is, to predict their personality later, which I just think is remarkable. So the research on the genetics of personality estimate the heritability to be around 0.5. So thinking back to earlier in the semester, you should know what that means. It means about 50% of the variance in personality in the population is due to genetics. So that means, yeah, genetics play a pretty big role in personality, but also means that a huge chunk of the pie is still up for grabs, meaning that it's not all about genetics. So this brings me to the next option in terms of what are influences for personality. So this is environmental influences. So think back to when we talked about learning. So we talked about, operant conditioning, classical conditioning, and in that lecture I mentioned that behaviorists don't believe in free will. Behaviorists are going to say that the reason people do the things they do are because some behaviors are rewarded and they're more likely to do it again in the future, and some behaviors are punished, meaning they're less likely to do it again. And so whether they're rewarded or punished is probably going to depend on the situation. So a behaviorist is going to say the consistency in behavior is because of reward and punishment, and any variability you see is maybe because reward and punishment will differ based on the situation. So that's obviously one way of thinking about it. But there's this other line of thought called social cognitive learning theorists, which essentially say, yeah, learning plays a role. So whether or not something is rewarded or punished is going to influence how people behave in the future. That's absolutely right. But this social and cognitive part here that's tacked on the beginning should help you hopefully understand this second part, that it isn't just about the reward or punishment. It is also about their expectations, that there is some reflection and critical thinking that follows, that the people are aware and are in some ways making conscious decisions about how to behave. So it isn't just kind of happening, under the layer of consciousness like a behaviorist would suggest. And so essentially what we do know is that we have a core set of traits, kind of going back to what we talked about a couple slides ago, that people do have these kind of primary traits that really characterize who they are, how they behave, think, and feel. But we also know that there is some flexibility to how people behave. So again, going back to what I said on, I think it was like slide 3, talking about that, yes, personality is stable, but it's relatively stable, which allows for some, again, flexibility or differences. So we call this reciprocal determinism, meaning that personality is probably going to impact the situations we choose or how we maybe behave in those situations. And then the situation will also impact personality traits or how those traits are expressed. And so that's why it's reciprocal, meaning that it's kind of a give and take, back and forth, bi-directional relationship. And so your textbook also highlights this idea of non-shared environment. So non-shared environment would be aspects of your life, your family, day-to-day environment that are unique to you. So they are not shared with other family. And so what we know from personality research is that shared environments, so shared family experiences, really don't impact personality. It's more of the non-shared. So that helps us understand why we're different from our siblings. Maybe we're different from our parents. Even though you live in the same household, you have the same caregivers, you eat the same food, there's a lot of differences in your day-to-day life. Different friends, you play different sports, different instruments, you're in different classes with different teachers. And so it's those non-shared environment factors, not shared, that are really going to impact personality development. And your book also really highlights the influence of peers. I think we get so hung up on parents when we talk about why kids turn out the way they do. And really our peers are a major contributor as well, because again, they fall under that non-shared environment. Another area we need to consider in terms of influences on personality is culture. So we talk about culture in the field of psychology. We often divide cultures into whether they're individualistic or collectivistic. So by individualistic, we mean that the self is basically the center, that the decisions are made more in terms of what the individual wants to do, what their relationships are. It's more about the person and their goals. Collectivistic cultures, on the other hand, the individual exists within relationships, and so it's more about trying to balance the person's goals with the kind of needs and larger goals of the community or friends or family. And so, it's interesting when we look at why people do the things they do, we tend to overemphasize personality traits and really undervalue these kind of cultural expectations or cultural norms, because a lot of why we end up doing the things we do in day-to-day life actually stem from cultural expectations. And then this last section of your book talks about humanistic or humanist psychology, which is essentially another way of framing and talking about personality. And so humanist psychology essentially developed as this kind of like other option or other lens that you can view people through. And it really frames it from more of a positive angle. So you can look at, behaviorists, psychologists as, again, saying free will doesn't exist. You can look at psychodynamic, and psychodynamic, it's kind of the dark and ugly side of people, right? Like aggressive urges and conflict in terms of, sexual instincts. And it's kind of the dark take on people or the evil take on people. And so humanist psychology was kind of another way of framing and talking about why people do what they do. And so it really kind of, again, added this balance that we can talk about it from the stance of people want to do better. So personal growth, people are resilient, overwhelmingly, that people are just trying to work towards some goals that are meaningful to them. And so it really framed it more from a positive psychology stance, which again is more of how people, try to get better and grow and mature, rather than framing it in terms of the negative or the difficulties people experience. So just another, again, kind of lens you can view it through. Humanist psychology has informed a particular type of psychotherapy. So humanist psychology is not just housed within personality psychology. It also kind of translates to clinical psychology. I would say those forms of psychotherapy are not quite as popular as some of the other types of interventions that we typically do. But just know that, this is a kind of area or line of personality that has kind of blended over into clinical psychology as well. So that's what I had for chapter 14. I hope everyone's doing well. Please let me know if you have any questions.